everybody. I would like to welcome you to the panel on data protection challenges in humanitarian action. So hopefully you are on the right room. There were some changes on this panel. Unfortunately, Caroline could not make it, so I will be moderating. And also Chris Kuner could also not join us, and he apologizes for his not being able to do so, not join us today. But we are certain that the topic will be adequately presented to you by the esteemed colleagues that are on this panel. This is a panel hosted by the Brussels Privacy Hub, and the topic, humanitarian action and data protection, is quite close to my heart because I've been working for at least 2 years with half of the people on this panel on producing the International Red Cross and Brussels Privacy Hub handbook on data protection humanitarian action, on which I think Massimo will tell us a bit more later. However, not everybody on this panel worked together with us on the handbook, and this is good because I think that a topic that was undeservedly did not receive as much attention as it merits now has come to the fore. Catherine will tell us a bit more on the topic.
Thank you, Vagelis. Good morning, everybody. I'm glad to see that so many people are interested in following this panel discussion devoted to the topic data protection's challenges in humanitarian action. I'm honored to be chairing this panel today. I am convinced that we are going to have some interesting discussions given the fact that we have very complementary panelists with us here today. So the collection and the processing of personal data plays a key role to the work of international organizations and NGOs in protecting and delivering essential aid to hundreds of millions of vulnerable individuals. Over the last years, the use of new technologies has increased, as well as the complexity of data flows and the growth of involved stakeholders. Privacy International played a key role in raising awareness as to the challenges of data processing in humanitarian work already in 2013 in their report Aiding Surveillance. 2 years later, in 2015, the International Conference of Privacy and Data Protection Commissioners recognized the need for data protection guidelines that international organizations and NGOs could apply to their work. To this effect, the conference adopted a resolution on privacy and international humanitarian action. A working group coordinated by the Association of French-speaking Data Protection Authorities, the Cpdp, was quickly set up to ensure the implementation of the resolution. At the time of the adoption of the resolution, the ICRC and the Brussels Privacy Hub had just launched a working series on data protection and humanitarian action, which aimed at analyzing the main data protection and privacy questions arising in humanitarian action and to provide guidance to the humanitarian community. Since this project was completely in line with the recommendations of the resolution, the working group engaged in the working series to assist the humanitarian community draw up guidelines on the application of data protection and privacy requirements. The working series, as said before by Vagelis, has now been completed and has led to the publication of a handbook on data protection and humanitarian action. Massimo will talk about it later. And the handbook, hopefully, and the handbook which will also soon be available in French, as I understand. It will not come as a surprise to you when I say that the GDPR will change the data protection landscape and hopefully spur better practices. With the introduction of the accountability principle, the GDPR requires that the controller is responsible for making sure all privacy principles are adhered to, and he needs to be able to demonstrate it. Accountability will help moving data protection from theory to practice, as this principle needs to be embedded in the organizations. The ways to incorporate this principle are woven throughout the GDPR, and it foresees various accountability principle instruments like the appropriate data protection policies, privacy by design and by default, IT risk secure management, data breach notification, and DPAs, amongst others. And if they want to comply with this new regulation, the international organizations and the NGO will have to adapt. They will need to rethink their data protection policy if they already have one in place, or to implement one. They will need to put in place tools, as said, to implement those policies, and put in place procedures for redressing poor compliance on data breaches, and of course inform and train people. So that's a lot to achieve, and one big challenge will certainly be finding the necessary resources. Before handing over to the panelists, I would just like to recall that data protection legislation is not a barrier. It provides a framework to strike a balance between the rights of individuals and other competing interests, where personal information can be used with confidence that individuals' privacy rights are respected.
Thank you, Catherine. At least at this point, I would like to stress that I am very happy that Catherine is chairing this panel, because as a representative of the Swiss DPA, indeed the Swiss DPA has taken positive measures, has always assisted the cause, and has always been present at all steps of research and work on this field. I think rightfully so, because admittedly, at least the ICRC is located, headquartered, which is something to be discussed actually in this panel. But we are happy to have the Swiss DPA represented and indeed chairing this panel. Regarding technicalities of this panel, there will be approximately 10-minute introductions by the panelists. Ben Parker from IRIN News will be first, followed by Alexandrine from Privacy International, Massimo from International Red Cross, and Alex Beck from the UNHCR. And then I will open the discussion with the audience and address any questions that you have. So the first to make the presentation is Ben Parkin from IRIN News, the humanitarian news service well known to all of us. So, Ben.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today. It's a topic, I think, even you privacy experts perhaps haven't got your heads entirely around some of the strange behavior of the international humanitarian system, and I hope to give you some thoughts. We, at IRIN, we write journalism about humanitarian situations for the benefit of the people affected. So we are a non-profit news service. We specialize in humanitarian emergencies, their causes, how they're responded to, and hopefully sometimes their successful resolution. And we've been poking around on the subject of data protection and technology recently, and have turned over a few rocks and have been quite shocked on what we found. So I'll talk to you today on two areas, 3 reasons why the humanitarian sector is kind of weird, and how its weirdness contributes to risk in the area of data protection. And then I'll give you, if I have time, a couple of examples of some hairy projects we came across. First of all, to set the scene, there's a database of 26 million people now being developed in Rome, 5.8 million of whom there are biometric records attached. And it is under no jurisdiction of any country in the world, neither is it under the jurisdiction of the European Union. This piece of software has been cooked up by contractors and international civil servants in the heart of the international system at the United Nations, and according to an audit released conveniently somewhere around Christmas Day, it doesn't work. It crashes when you try to make an edit, and it is being rolled out in Sudan and Syria and Somalia and amongst the Rohingya refugees. And I think in any other circumstance this would be an astonishing project to even imagine in the European context, but because of the immunity of the International Civil Service and the United Nations, they are full steam ahead. So how does it get to be like this? I'm going to say the three areas of why the humanitarian system gets into trouble and can get into trouble on data protection. Number one, it's an oligopoly, right? There are only a handful of major agencies who control the vast majority of the funding that flows into disaster relief. There are three big aid agencies control pretty much half the money, and 30 agencies control 85% of the funding on humanitarian aid. So there isn't a healthy spirit or culture or economy of competition and rivalry on the basis of quality. The incumbents, mainly the large UN agencies and the International Red Cross family, pretty much have the whole market to themselves, and the barriers to entry are extremely high. So there you have a fairly unhealthy oligopoly to begin with. Secondly, that those organizations have a bizarre political circumstance in that their money comes from one end, but their clients are at another end. So if I'm a refugee in Bangladesh, I have no power over the people who are helping me. The power, in fact, lies with the taxpayer of the donor at the other end. So there's a very unusual and unhealthy, potentially dangerous power relationship in which the client of the industry, if we can call it an industry, really has no authority, either political or financial, over its behavior. Also, continuing on the nature of the oligopoly, there's very little media scrutiny on these entities, and a lot of the media coverage of aid agencies is either aren't they amazing, let's give them money, or aren't they catastrophically corrupt and wasteful? And there isn't very much sensible media coverage in the middle. The second area where this industry is weird and therefore gets into trouble is that a lot of its behaviors are also opaque and unclear to the public. One big example is competition. You may not see it in public, but the charities who raise money from you at Christmas are violently competitive, although they would not like to admit it. And the pursuit of shiny new technology projects is a way to look better in front of the public and to look better in front of institutional donors. And hence, sometimes the temptation is to cut corners and try risky things. So the third area where this gets weird is that the people who are in need of these solutions, quote unquote, big quote unquote, scare quotes in fact, are literally running for their lives. So if I'm in South Sudan and you tell me, and I've never been to school properly, you're going to tell me my fingerprint is going to be in the cloud, and I've just had my house burnt. It's just the gap between the needs of, for example, informed consent, or a healthy relationship between the gatherer of the data and the data subject is exceptionally difficult to imagine working well. So these three characteristics, the exceptional risk, the opaqueness, and the oligopoly, have led us some pretty crazy situations, and we worry as independent observers, and I think many of my panelists also worry, that it's not a question of if, but when a data breach puts people who are already vulnerable at even greater risk. For the Rohingya refugees, their citizenship is already under question. Would it not be extremely helpful to the Myanmar security to have a digital database of all their names and fingerprints and where they came from? Would it not be super helpful for the Syrian regime to know who had been claiming what kind of aid while in Lebanon or Jordan under the protection of the neighboring countries? These digital databases are deliciously tasty for a number of negative actors, and the humanitarian community is happily cooking more and more delicious recipes. So, as well as the example of the huge database in Rome, I'll give you one more example. There's a software called Red Rose, which was developed by former aid workers who saw a business opportunity. its default setting is to collect 10 fingerprints and the photo and the GPS location and the name and the family history and the answers to the livelihood questionnaire of who lives in their house and how much money they have into a single web-based database. And some rival company looked up their training video online. This is used by like, a good 12 NGOs. Looked up the training video online, username Red Rose, password Red Rose, typed it in and obtained access to a live installation of the system working in northeastern Nigeria, where the Boko Haram extremist group has put hundreds of thousands of people on the run. The kind of naivety and of the password error is one thing, but then inside the software there are many other worrying examples of low quality software practice and hygiene. So we feel, I feel strongly that, that the humanitarian system has exceptional responsibilities and therefore needs to show exceptionally high standards. We hear a lot about policy. I've got to say, it's all hat and no cattle. It's an expression I learned the other day from the cowboy world. And a lot of the agencies we've contacted in the pursuit of our articles, they always come back to me and they say how great their policy is. I don't really care, and I'm concerned that bridging the gap between the policy and the reality is where we need to put the focus. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. To be honest, I could not have hoped for a better first presentation in this panel, because you introduced the notion of weird and weirdness of the field, and that was exactly my impression when I first entered the field a couple of years ago, because of its uniqueness and unique needs and characteristics. So thank you for that. Next is Alexandrine from Privacy International.
Thank you very much for giving us this opportunity to speak on this very important topic as part of Cpdp. Privacy International is a charity based in London, but we work internationally through an international network of partners and also regional and national partners to advocate for stronger privacy safeguards through research investigation, litigation, legal analysis, and targeted advocacy. The topic that we're discussing here today is one that Privacy International has been working on for many years, following the discussion around the data revolution, the MDGs, but also the Sustainable Development Goals, tech for development. But in 2013, and it was already mentioned, we consolidated our understanding and our problem analysis of this sector. And the aim of that report was as much to alert us to provide information that was currently lacking in the public discourse. We didn't have all of the answers, but we already wanted to put what we knew in the public sphere to spur a discussion on this topic. And also, as Privacy International, we are recipients of development funding, and we felt that it was also part of our responsibility to be alerting our own funders to some of the projects that they may be funding that were actually interfering with the right to privacy of beneficiaries. So in terms of the topic and what was posed to me today to kind of present the problem analysis of what we've seen, there are a few elements I want to touch upon and our observation as Privacy International. The first one in the analysis that we've done, what we're clearly seeing is that the humanitarian organizations, but also some of their donors, are not necessarily doing a thorough problem analysis as to what is pushing them to take on such data-intensive, tech-reliant, tech-dependent decisions within some of their programs. The other, and I'll go into more detail into that, the second element is around what we're seeing is a lack of or limited consideration of the risks that come with such decisions, particularly in terms of the new responsibility this puts upon humanitarian actors in terms of protecting the data of their beneficiaries. And the last one as well, which was also of concern, and I'll elaborate on that in my final point, was little consideration or understanding of the ecosystem in which these decisions were being made, with the role of the private sector and helping them achieve this, but also states, when we think about state surveillance as well. So understanding all of those dynamics are not always clear and within the discussions and decision making. And then linked to some was already discussed slightly is how does all of these things relate and are conveyed to the beneficiaries, who are the ultimate beneficiaries of these different initiatives in terms of what data is collected about them, why, for what purpose, what measures are being taken to protect their data, but also how does it fit within some of the challenges in the short term and long term that they may experience as individuals. So I'll briefly go into a little bit more detail into those three aspects. In terms of the problem analysis, what we're increasingly seeing is that humanitarian organizations are not necessarily clear as to what is the problem they're trying to solve. There are questions around fraud, corruption, efficiency, effectiveness, but because there's not necessarily they don't necessarily include audits or baseline in this problem analysis, an organization may assume or think that they have a big problem of fraud and that the solution is to deploy a mass biometric identification authentication system of their beneficiaries, but because no audit is done further down the line, it's unclear whether that actually has resolved their problem. The second element of that is we're not seeing whether decisions also include what are the least invasive ways of solving that problem. Are we sticking with cash transfer programs that are cash in hand, or are we choosing to work with mobile operators or directly with banking institutions? So in terms of the criteria, in terms of what are the different options available to them, and are they going and for the least intrusive way possible given to them, or are they going for convenience as well, because they're operating in very challenging environments? So linked to that as well, in terms of what considerations are given in terms of the choices that they make, is around the risk assessments. Risk assessments are being done, and they're increasingly being done by a lot of organizations who have now adopted their own privacy and data protection policies. But linked to that, and that's not in relation necessarily to responsibility of the humanitarian organization, is that there isn't enough information out there as to how the devices that they're using, the software that they're using, the hardware that they're buying from the private sector, how are all of those actually, how do they operate, how they design, what data is generated from them, and processed in the short and long term about beneficiary, what is the data life cycle of that data. And so without having all of that information, it's really hard for anyone to do a risk assessment. And this relates to the broader work that Privacy International is doing in terms of demanding more accountability and transparency from the private sector who are developing these tools on which humanitarian organizations rely, because very few of them have the resources to develop their own products. They rely on these third parties. And so the lack of transparency and accountability of how those operate makes it very difficult to really have informed risk assessments. And that can have very severe consequences when we know some of the providers of those technologies also have different branches within them. They have exploitative business models. So at the end of the day, they're there to make a profit, but we also have the state as well, who play a role in that, who have their own either secret or even public agreements that impose obligation on some of these companies as well to comply with various laws. And how does that fit within the obligations that these companies have both in the countries they're operating, and how does that interfere with their engagement with organizations and third parties like humanitarian organizations. So there's all these challenges that need to be put in place into threat modeling of really understanding what is at play here, what needs to be protected and how, and who are potential adversaries that would want to access that data at any point of the data life cycle as well. And this brings another element in terms of the increasing number of intermediaries in humanitarian programs. And from the moment of receiving the funds by major international humanitarian organizations, many of them rely on national partners for implementations. If a humanitarian organization has taken all the steps that it could to address some of the challenges that I've already presented, can it guarantee that at every single step of the way, the people that they're working with, the other organizations on which they rely, are also adopting the same safeguards? Because if we're only doing it at the starting point, that's not enough. We need to be seeing it applied across the board. And that relates to really a lack of control of humanitarian organizations to control the data that they feel that they are protecting from the onset, to them being possibly misused and abused in the long term as well. And that's particularly relevant for humanitarian organizations. And in terms of who do they choose to operate with? Are they going to be making conditional contractual obligations with implementing partners, demanding that they have those processes in place? And how do you enforce that? Are there enough resources within these organizations to look around enforcement of contractual obligations? And in a case where these are not respected, what are the measures that would be taken by humanitarian organizations to rectify that violation? And then ultimately, is any of what I've just said even shared with beneficiaries? Are beneficiaries informed, aware, and can they have any control of the decisions that are made along the way in terms of the data that's collected about them? And so, as we've been very happy to see that since 2013, a lot of things have changed. I think the authors of the report that was mentioned, Aiding Surveillance, I think it would have been very hard for us to imagine that 5 years down the line, we're going to have this sort of discussion. So that's something we very much welcome. Having said that, now we need to go to the next step. We have much more information as to what's going on. And now we need to be thinking about solutions and to be implementing them as soon as possible, because this is happening every day. Every day refugees are being registered. Every day decisions are being made about these very beneficiaries on the dependence on these systems. And if there are violations occurring, we need to be addressing them as soon as possible and seeing what support we can be providing and to prevent future violations occurring. So hopefully, I was asked to present the problem, so I'm not going to dwell too much on the solutions, but my fellow panelists will talk about solutions, and hopefully I can comment on their contributions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandrine. To a large extent, I think that your presentation addressed Ben's highlighting of the problem of opaqueness on humanitarian organization action, and thank you for that. Indeed, scrutiny does come out of organizations that are not in the small, admittedly, circle of organizations and academics around them. And indeed, from Privacy International, such a well-known organization, and so far behind in time, actually, because you identified the technologies since 4 years ago, which is impressive. So next in line is Massimo, who has told me that has a presentation. Are you going to? Yep. All set? Okay. Massimo from the International Red Cross.
Thank you very much. After this gloomy picture about the humanitarian world, the difficult task to explain how this world of humanitarian action fits in with the regulatory framework that we've been discussing over the last 2 days at the conference at Cpdp. There are lots of new regulatory developments, the GDPR, Council of Europe Modernized Convention 108. So if there are all these problems, how does this world interact with the solutions that are being highlighted from a regulatory point of view? So this is probably the more boring part of the panel. This is why I have to rely on some slides to make some points and to get them to come across. I would say that there are two key elements that come in the picture when we're looking at the interaction between the regulatory framework that is around us and humanitarian work. The first one being the nature of a large number of organizations that are active in humanitarian work, being international organizations. And the second aspect is the substance of the work they're doing in emergency and in humanitarian crisis. And so there are specific provisions in data protection that are relevant and of interest in analysis. As we go through this, we will also be speaking about new technologies and about the challenges that have been identified, thanks also to our friends here, and how we have been dealing with these challenges. I cannot speak for the humanitarian world for sure, but I can speak for what we have been doing. So this is broadly what I'm planning to address in the little time that we have, but this is what I just said. So I'll first perhaps a little introduction about ourselves, who we are. Not everybody might be familiar with the humanitarian world, and so I will not go through the story of the gentleman from Geneva that in that dark and gloomy night of 24th of June, 1859 went and happened to be on the battlefield of Solferino, but perhaps just a couple of words of who we are. The ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, is a neutral, impartial, independent organization that has the exclusively humanitarian mission of protecting the life and the dignity of victims of armed conflicts and to provide them with assistance. This is very important. It sounds like the usual introduction and the spiel, but it is actually the reason for existing of the organization is to protect the life and the dignity of people affected by armed conflicts, the most vulnerable. So this focus on the dignity makes it very clear that there is actually a lot of commonality of interest and a lot of commonality of drivers in data protection, which is based on the dignity of the individual when it comes to the processing of their personal data, and the dignity of the individual when they are at the most vulnerable in the situations in which we come across. And so concepts and principles of data protection, without ever having been called so, have been integrated and part of the guidelines, policies, standard operating procedures, reflexes, DNA of the colleagues that are every day in the field. So the GDPR, the GDPR and Council of Europe Convention 108, when it comes to international organizations working in the humanitarian sector, for the purposes of the GDPR and the Council of Europe Convention, international organizations are as considered for all intents and purposes like third countries. So all data flows that happen under the GDPR and under the supervisory authorities, under the control of supervisory authorities, where individuals can have access to a court, they're fine. They can happen because precisely there's this umbrella of certainty. The moment that data of individuals that has been collected under the GDPR leaves and goes to a third country or to an international organization, there are these islands of immunity, big danger, big red alarms. And so the GDPR imposes Chapter 5 guarantees to make sure that the moment they leave the protection and the safeguards of the GDPR, the additional protections are taken to ensure that the protection that was enjoyed is not lost in the process. Interestingly, international organizations are defined in the GDPR. It is a defined term, what an international organization is. Article 4. And interestingly, international organizations are actually invited and encouraged to become members of Convention 108. There's the sense that we want to make sure, Convention 108, that we extend the protection as much as possible of the convention, and that international organizations are encouraged to become members. Now, for the purposes of analyzing whether an international organization is worthy to be considered for membership and to continue to be part of the Convention 108, there is a questionnaire that looks precisely at all the problems that are involved in the analysis, the privileges and immunity status, and already provides some clear guidelines as to what is expected from an international organization from the point of view of data protection. What is expected is a clear framework of compliance with rules, with supervisory authorities, and with the provision of an effective remedy. Those 5 minutes went very fast. So I will not dwell on the principle of effective remedy, and I'll skip this one as well. But just to illustrate quickly on what the ICRC has been doing about this. The ICRC developed the ICRC rules framework for compliance and the ICRC rules on personal data protection. Based on a number of elements that were around us. First of all, the element of dignity, which is what I mentioned before. On all the regulatory developments that were happening around us, the ICRC is observer at the Council of Europe Expert Committee on Convention 108 and followed very closely the process of modernization, followed the negotiations and the discussions about the GDPR. Most of all, it's based on the direct experience of protecting vulnerable people in the field. And so these rules reflect what it means to translate data protection principles in humanitarian action. The system of compliance involved the creation of a data protection office, precisely to ensure the application of the rules. I fully agree with a comment that was mentioned, that was made earlier by Ben about the fact that it's meaningless to have a nice policy and set of rules that sits there and gathers dust on a shelf. And this is why it was considered fundamental to have a data protection office that has a staff of 7 at the moment. But not only that, the whole organization takes ownership of the rules. And there are a number of colleagues here in the audience that are not part of the Data Protection Office that are here with us today, and that shows that it's an effort that is certainly felt by the organization as a whole. And the creation of a Data Protection Commission, whose task is to provide that effective remedy. Key areas that are of relevance when it comes to humanitarian action under the GDPR. I will not spend a lot of time on it because we don't have a lot of time, but we can discuss in more detail. Lawfulness of processing. An entity that is under the GDPR that is supposed to transfer data to an international organization or to process data for humanitarian purposes, can they really rely on consent? And that was a question that was very interestingly pointed out earlier, and we can debate about it later. Consent possibly not always the best and more appropriate way of processing data. So what are the alternatives? And these are mentioned in some of the recital of the regulation. There are questions about restrictions of rights, also detailed in the regulation recitals, and transfers that are also mentioned in the regulation recitals. I hope I didn't press the wrong button. Interesting questions about public interest were also dealt well before discussions in the GDPR by decision of number of decisions by regulatory authorities. The CNIL in France dealt with restoring family links activities and considered them to be in the public interest. Couple of words quickly, if I still have time, about new technologies. I mentioned earlier it's part of dealing with the dignity, with the data of individuals. And so it's part of the innate reflexes of the colleagues that are every day in the field. Why then have we been focusing so much lately on new technologies? Partially because some of our friends have been pointing out that actually in adopting new technologies, there might be a little bit too much enthusiasm in the humanitarian sector without actually reflecting properly on the possible implications. And so as we face increasingly challenges in the field, and I just really want to stress this look at new technology is not about, finding something new and sexy to do. It's in response to a changing humanitarian environment in which conflicts last longer. The ICRC is present in the 10 largest operations in which it has been present for over 35 years, and you find situations of vulnerability of the state system that cannot provide, and so people need return and repeated aid. And so questions about is it appropriate to use cash become increasingly relevant, cash transfer programming. Conflict environments become very difficult to read, fragmented, splinter groups. You're not talking about the army in blue facing the army in red. Now you face different fractions and different groups. You do not know who you're talking to anymore. Can you have access to areas? And so questions about big data, can it help us have better reading of the environment? Become questions that become relevant. Questions around the volatility of situations and access to environments. In the last year, these are not theoretical questions, in the last 5 years, we lost on average 12 colleagues every year, did not make it back to their families, and as they were trying to do their job. And it's becoming increasingly difficult and more risky to get to areas. And digital proximity might become something to complement that. Is it worth exploring ways of using messaging apps? Is it worth exploring the use of drones? These are questions that are becoming relevant. And so obviously we were aware when these questions were starting to emerge about the fact that these involve many risks. And this was why it was clear for us that while we were well versed in analyzing risks in a physical world, we were not so well equipped in analyzing risks that emerge from the digital environment, where numerous more processors are involved. And so we thought it was fundamental to get together with our friends at the Brussels Privacy Hub, data protection authorities, a number of partners and other humanitarian organizations that are present also in this room today, and civil society, to look at how these technologies can be responsibly taken on board. And so this led to the initiative with the Brussels Privacy Hub on data protection and humanitarian action. We looked at the possible use of drones, big data, cloud-based solutions, messaging apps, mobile cache programs, and biometrics. And there's a chapter in relation to each of these in the handbook that was published. Now I think we can play a quick video of 1 minute to illustrate this. I don't know if it works. It doesn't work, so that solves it. Does it work? Maybe we have some help at the end.
Protecting individuals' personal data is an integral part of protecting their life and dignity. This is why personal data protection is of fundamental importance for humanitarian organizations. The International Committee of the Red Cross teamed up with the Brussels Privacy Hub to bring together leading experts on data protection to produce a practical guide to the issues facing humanitarian organizations. The Handbook on Data Protection in Humanitarian Action seeks to raise awareness and assist humanitarian organizations in ensuring that they comply with personal data protection standards when carrying out their activities. After an initial analysis of the application of data protection principles to humanitarian action, the handbook considers the data protection implications of using specific new technologies in the humanitarian sector. These include data analytics, drones, biometrics, cash transfer programming, cloud computing services, and messaging apps.
Thanks. Nice video. I admit I did not know it existed. But now, okay, thanks. Thank you, Massimo, for bringing in the GDPR into our discussion. And it was not boring, but I'm a lawyer, so how do I know?
Yes, lawyer, like us.
So, last but not least is Alex from the UN Refugee Agency. On a personal note, Alex, I am based in Athens, so because we are affected, whatever you do and say will be... No, we are actually depending on you guys from a political point of view too. So.
Thank you, Vagelis. Yeah, good morning, everybody. Thanks, first of all, to the Brussels Privacy Hub for inviting me. I accepted to be on the panel before I knew that Ben Parker would be here. And Alexandrine, Privacy International, we know them a bit longer, so that's fine. It's a pleasure to be here because I feel a spirit of let's say reasonable critique, sense of let's have a reasonable amount of doubt what in this case humanitarian agencies do, and that's already a very good start. What maybe you should be aware, and this is of course my very simplistic perception or way of presenting it. The panel in a way is more homogeneous than you think. We have two who represent in a way this critical doubt and the external watchdogs that we need a lot, and then you have two who really try to do as much as they can within maybe please bold, underlined everything, among the best humanitarian agencies in terms of data protection. That's certainly the case with regard to ICRC. As far as we are concerned, thank you, Ben, for not exposing us too much, and I feel in a way also a bit for my colleagues from the World Food Programme, and we could add International Organization for Migration and UNICEF. We have made certain steps that can always be considered to be glass half full or half empty. That's better than nothing, but not enough. I think this is in a way my conclusion of where we are. UNHCR has maybe, if we compare ourselves with especially IOM and also WFP, the advantage here, and if we talk data protection, that our mandate, this is part of a General Assembly resolution, so it's part of international law, is to protect refugees. and to search for durable solutions. That's it. And this is a very specific mandate because it's related to persons or groups of persons. And the term protection, yeah, it was chosen for very, very good reasons back in 1950. And it reappears today in the term of data protection. So in a way, data protection found an easy home in our mandate, which is not necessarily the case with other agencies. This is a bit of a sort of big picture, almost theoretical, but it's not only theory. Remark. I thought I'll give you a few examples of our classical work, which involves data processing. The first is based on this protection mandate in countries where state authorities do not exist or are not able or willing to protect refugees as they should under international law, especially if they have ratified the other Geneva Convention, the Geneva Convention on the Status of Refugees of 1951. If that doesn't exist, UNHCR has since many, many years, in a way this is an exceptional task, but it became almost a novelty, developed the capacity to register refugees, to conduct what is called in a state context an asylum procedure to determine whether someone is a refugee or not. And the solutions part of the mandate is, for example, to resettle individuals to countries that are willing to accept them. All this involves the processing of very sensitive personal data. This is done since many years. What's happening now is that we not only conduct interviews, listen to the story that people tell us, take notes, make a legal decision in a way not binding on states. This is at least for us, but also for the public to know there are refugees in this country, and then potentially work on a resettlement solution. For example, we have introduced since a few years, and now this is becoming a standard, to add biometric data. We have started with a system that was not very developed, based on a Dutch product that I think was used in prisons, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily bad. It was just not very performant. One impact assessment was done, which we then never even published. I think it was done by someone working in Privacy International till today, and someone who is not with them anymore. Today we have a more performant system, clearly a product from the private sector, but very much designed for our purposes. And we take as a rule, not in every country, but it's rolled out, 10 fingerprints and iris scans. We have a separate system in Jordan and Lebanon. That was the topic also of newspaper articles, iris guard, which is part of a cash assistance system. What is done right now is an impact assessment on the biometric system that we're using now as a rule, essentially. And I'm trying to follow this as the UNHCR's first DPO, in a way, as much as I can. We have used a consultant for that. I've also pushed for this to become, at least as part of the executive summary, public. So I fully subscribe to what I've said before. We have to become more transparent. This is a first careful attempt in this direction. We'll see what the impact assessment will come out with. The other example is, of course, cash assistance. It was mentioned before. This is situations where, as Massimo said, conflicts last longer. Refugees therefore have to stay longer times in their host countries. One aspect is they move on, but another aspect is that they basically have to restart lives. And we of course, we try to make this as good as possible. But I also do not deny that certain technologies are I wouldn't say imposed, but they're there. And I think Ben's analysis with regard to the unhealthy situation. We have only very few of us agencies. We have donors that are very important. For example, the ECHO from the European Union. The other important one could mention is the British development arm, DFID, that have agendas or not. I'm not into this a lot, but this is a certain reality. And also, I would not be ever in a position to say no to certain technology that is accepted by us. What we are aware of, and we are looking into agreements and also the practical security risks, is with which bank, for example, we talk about cash assistance, do we work? Are there links back to the country of origin? Are there reporting obligations of that bank to other countries? We look at which partners do we work with, or which partners is the agency with whom we work, namely WFP working with. And there's a growing network of agreements based on models that we've developed in place that are a condition for us to engage. So it is a period where we are reluctantly engaging under certain conditions, not knowing the full consequences, because impact assessments are not yet done as a rule. This is something I've mentioned with my colleagues, but we are in a situation where we haven't really started yet. We don't know exactly how it works, and therefore we are reluctantly engaging. The last example I wanted to mention is the announcement of the High Commissioner to give all refugees a digital identity. This is very much related to a sustainable development goal. If we are a bit in this area, the famous 16.9, which has more the background of a civil registration to make sure that everybody has a legal identity. We transformed this into a digital identity, partly because, and I'm not sure whether we would have done that without these developments. There is a lot of interest. Of course, there's the private sector also behind that, among initiatives. Sometimes it's more the World Bank, then there are others, also regional. There's one in Africa. It's a quite a nice list of sort of digital identity initiatives that are all looking at the Sustainable Development Goals. And frankly, we, as far as I've heard from senior management, we are in a position, do we want others to let this do, including registering refugees in every host country, if the state is not doing it? Or do we want to get ourselves in the business? And the answer is clear. We have the mandate. We believe it's better we do it than letting it someone else doing it. I have no answers to this, and the answers are certainly not easy. There will be always somewhere in the middle. We cannot avoid it. We cannot avoid cash assistance using even biometrics, and our registration, there's no way back. We have to make it minimize risks as much as possible, and maybe, yes, something will or has to happen until we become more serious in taking the risks seriously. Let me summarize with three challenges that were still, of course, not really resolved. UNHCR in 2015, we came up with the policy. This would have been the one slide that I decided not to show for various reasons. It's on the internet, our policy on the protection of personal data of persons of concern. This is a subscription of people in our mandate. The good thing is, it's not that it mentions privacy by design and impact assessments. It's binding. It is a binding High Commissioner's policy on all UNHCR staff. And we make it also, in a way, binding on partners that want to work with us. So many NGOs have, in a way, to respect this, look into it, when they want to work for us. And these are a lot, thousands, nationals, but also internationals. So in a way, we do what the EU does, we export our standards. It is one attempt I cannot claim we found the right mix of what could be considered internationally to be the right data protection standards. Especially listening here to some panels, we have to think about this ongoing, and we're going to revise this policy as a regular process in 2 years. The next is, I'll be brief, capacity. I cannot underline this more. ICRC has a certain capacity in this data protection office. I'm for the moment alone. I don't think, I hope this is not going to last. You can only expect and request from an organization as much as there is some capacity. We need, of course, to work with partners, but I could express a loud outcry for help, which probably my colleagues from WFP and IOM would subscribe as well. And therefore, the partnerships we enjoy so far are extremely important. And the last one is, yes, I'm glad I'm here with Alexandrine and Ben, because we need the critical eyes. I'm convinced if this is done in a responsible way, it helps us to convince senior management to take this more seriously and to invest more resources. Thank you.
Well, dear Alex, when you spoke about critical doubt, I think that you exactly nailed the spirit, if not the scope, of this panel. Because I think that we look up to what you guys do, and we even admire what you do, but we do keep our well-meant doubts. And speaking of doubts, it is now time to give the floor to people in the room who would like to raise questions to any of our panelists. So, please.
Thanks, Pirlot, for Privacy Matters. It's a question for Alexander. Alexander, given the many millions of data, very sensitive data that your agency collects, how many people work on data protection and privacy?
In UNHCR?
Yes, so you know, you're saying you're the DPO. I'm a DPO in an organization. So how big is the team? How many people are doing this?
Yeah. That's good, because as a general remark, what is needed is for those who have an interest to look as much as possible into the agencies, how they are set up. So what the policy says is we have interpreted the data controller in an internal logic, allocating the responsibility where it already sits, and this is. The policy says it's usually the person responsible for deciding the purposes, etc., is the representative. That's the highest UNHCR official in the country operation. You imagine UNHCR as other organizations with a headquarters, but many, many more country offices. We are in 120 plus countries, and some of these offices are quite big, some are smaller. Before coming back to data protection, I was myself a senior protection officer in our office in Algiers. In this function, I was at the same time what we call in the policy a data protection focal point. So every office has, and I have a list, a data protection focal point. They are supposed to assist the representative in all questions related to the processing of personal data. That means we have, in every country office, we have someone who is supposed to take responsibility. That's usually the representative, someone who is supposed to be the, not expert, but the person who is the closest already to the subject matter, and these are the most senior protection people. Many lawyers, not necessary, so they can familiarize themselves fairly quickly with the policy, and they have to take the decisions. The focal points are in a way my network. The ones with whom I'm still new in a way, a few months that I've started this. I am communicating with, I'm telling them what I'm doing, they ask me questions. This works quite well when it comes to agreements. When we sign agreements, whether it's with the host country, whether it's with other agencies, NGOs, and the private sector. We have model agreements, and the agreements, this is where the DPO and UNHCR has a double role, as also, in a way, a DPA. I have to clear every agreement that we are signing. It's often easy where we are managing to use model agreements. Sometimes clauses have to be negotiated, and I'm advising. So a certain practice has started since the policy was adopted. I can say from my experience, this still has to be documented for you. It works fairly well. It is already too much for me to do this. I have to respond a lot to requests, and from the quality of the questions I receive, I can see that data protection is a reality in UNHCR. Many people are aware of it. Many people have read the policy. I'm becoming very detailed questions. This is encouraging. We have to do a lot more, but this is how you can imagine how it is for the moment.
Thanks. I now have Gloria and Massimo who wish to take the floor. Is it on the same question, or is it? Okay, then Gloria first, and then. Okay.
Hello.
We'll try. We'll do our best.
I'm Gloria González Fuster from the Free University of Brussels. I have been trying to follow this subject of humanitarian action for a while, but I'm still struggling to understand how it works. And Massimo was saying there are many organizations involved, and then the first speaker was saying it's an oligopoly or a monopoly, or there's a limited number of actors who are actually receiving the money, so I'm still don't really understanding what is happening. For me, it seems the technologies that some of you were mentioning, just referring to the technologies that could be possibly the greatest challenge for the privacy data protection perspective. And I believe there are, of course, private companies, technology developers, and there was a reference to this challenge of how do you, I can trust more or less the international organizations, agencies. I know you have clear mandates, but what happens, who controls, how do we make sure that these technologies and those private companies that are, I think, are more and more active on the field, how do we make sure that they comply, that they understand the challenges? That's my question. Thank you.
Okay, and Massimo?
Thank you. I'll probably start from the last point that was raised, and when I referred to a multiplicity of actors and a large number of actors, what I was referring was precisely to what you mentioned afterwards, which is the implication of using new technologies means that all of a sudden it's not just anymore the humanitarian aid worker sitting in confidence with the individual. What happens afterwards is that you also have to deal with a financial institution that would potentially be processing the cash payment, a mobile phone provider that will be carrying out the transfer, a whole host of people that are not actually meant to be sitting in that room with the beneficiary are involved. And so this requires a much more detailed analysis of the data flows, the stakeholders involved. I mean, I cannot really go into a detailed analysis of the other part of the claim about the oligopoly. I mean, even my background is as an antitrust lawyer, actually, so I know that market analysis is very complex. But it's what I can say is certainly analysis of stakeholders and data flow is very, very important when new technologies come up. And this leads me to, I just wanted to make a comment in relation to the previous question that was asked by Pat. I know it was not addressed to me, but many people know that it's difficult to keep me quiet when somebody asks a question. Who is responsible for data protection? I think what we're really trying hard to ensure is that the mindset is that actually everybody who is in charge of a program is responsible for data protection, and that there is that ownership by the organization and by the programs of the principles of data protection. And this actually happens increasingly. I mean, it's certainly a culture that needs to take this into account, but it's something that is also possible thanks to some of the key principles of data protection as they have been developing. Data protection impact assessments, the responsibility for analyzing risks and being accountable for the way in which risks have been taken with the guidance of data protection experts is the responsibility of what we define in the rules as the staff in charge, which is the person who is in charge of a program. And so it is thanks to tools like this that really the people who are responsible for the application of the rules are people who are responsible for the program.
Thank you, Massimo. Now, Alexandrine wants to add.
Just a quick point on the roles and responsibilities of the private sector. I think there are different levels as well in terms of how we're addressing the implications for the private sector being involved. There's one, the engagement directly with the humanitarian organization. In their agreement and the services they provide, what data do they generate, what data do they process, and according to what rules do they do that. But then there's also the other aspect is once they have that data, what are the subsequent activities that they may, or the processing that they will do with that data, and how does that fit within their business model? So if we think of companies like Facebook, are they going to be doing targeted advertising of beneficiaries who are part of Facebook groups or who follow Facebook pages of humanitarian organizations, or suggest friends that they should not be suggesting who are actually on the other side of the conflict? Or for banks, for example, who are providing services of cash transfer programs, do they then use the data that they have to be selling and targeting them with financial services or credit programs? Or what are the subsequent processing that happens in that regard? And then the final one I briefly mentioned in my presentation is the obligations that some of these companies have, be it banks to comply with anti-money regulations around knowing your customer, but also telecom companies who are subject to regulations in terms of for criminal investigation or anti-terrorism or whatever it could be, when what decisions are going to be made when they demand the data of beneficiaries of aid money or humanitarian aid. What are the decisions and who makes that decision that they should or not have access to basically the data of the most vulnerable people that we have.
Thanks, Alexander. There is perhaps time for one last question, if there is one. No? Okay. Please.
I'm loud enough, aren't I? You can hear me, everybody? I'm not shy. So, in terms of data protection and impact assessment, should we in this sector, be thinking of human rights impact assessments?
Yeah, who wants to? Yeah.
I can.
By all means.
No, well, it would be interesting to discuss this a little bit more to understand exactly what you mean by that. But certainly what I can say is that in developing template and model impact assessments, what we realized that we had to do was actually to take into account a lot more than what is envisaged strictly in the standard impact assessments that we find on the market. And we actually had to do a lot of work internally with the colleagues who are running programs to understand what risks are actually relevant, to make them not just impact assessments about data protection, but useful tools for people that are trying to do the right thing, to actually take into account all the risks that they need to take into account. So certainly they're well beyond the standard impact assessments that we find on the market, if I can say so. And now the concept of an overall human rights impact assessment, I don't know, we need to discuss to try to understand more, but we can pick it up. Yeah.
Well, thank you. We have been warned, and lunch is important, of course, and lines can be long at Cpdp cafeteria next door. So thank you very much to you all for attending, and yes, thank you. Enjoy the rest of Cpdp.